Less than 50 kilometers off the coast of one of the busiest, most densely populated regions in the United States, sits a cluster of islands that almost nobody actually lives on. No sprawling coastal towns, no highways, no permanent residents at all across 4 out of the 5 islands that make up California's Channel Islands National Park. Just wind-scoured cliffs, a fox found absolutely nowhere else on Earth, and the buried evidence of one of the oldest known human settlements anywhere in North America. This is the Channel Islands, and they might be the most overlooked wilderness sitting practically in the shadow of Los Angeles. Picture an entire chain of islands close enough to see from the mainland on a clear day, yet so consistently overlooked that most people driving along the Southern California coast have no real idea they're even there. Picture a fox so small it could comfortably fit in a shoebox, found on these islands and nowhere else in the world, that came terrifyingly close to disappearing entirely within the past few decades. The Channel Islands are an 8-island archipelago scattered across the Southern California Bight. The wide, curving stretch of Pacific coastline, running roughly from Point Conception down toward San Diego, a geologically distinct chain split into 2 groups. 4 northern islands that once formed part of a single larger landmass geologists call Santa Rosa, before rising sea levels submerged the connecting terrain, and 4 southern islands with a separate volcanic origin entirely. 5 of those islands, Anacapa, Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, San Miguel, and tiny Santa Barbara Island fall under the protection of Channel Islands National Park, established in 1980 specifically to preserve their remarkably intact natural and cultural resources. The remaining 3 islands sit under different ownership entirely. Santa Catalina, the most developed and most visited, remains largely privately managed and partly open to tourism, while San Nicolas and San Clemente belong to the United States Navy, used for military testing and training, and closed to public access almost entirely. Their beaches and rugged interiors serving purposes ranging from missile testing to the kind of realistic, isolated terrain useful for military exercises that simply can't be replicated on the mainland. Despite sitting closer to a major metropolitan area than almost any other national park in the country, the 5 islands within Channel Islands National Park receive only a small fraction of the visitors that flock to more famous parks like Yosemite or Yellowstone each year, a genuine wilderness hiding in plain sight, visible from the mainland, yet functionally as remote as anywhere in the continental United States, largely because reaching any of them still requires a boat crossing across open, often rough water that keeps casual, spontaneous visits genuinely rare. That relative obscurity has helped preserve something genuinely extraordinary, a level of biological uniqueness, significant enough that scientists and park officials alike have taken to calling the islands North America's Galapagos. Roughly 150 species found on the islands exist absolutely nowhere else on Earth, the result of thousands of years of isolated evolution on land masses cut off from the mainland by open, often turbulent ocean water. Everything from the diminutive island scrub jay, found only on Santa Cruz Island and nowhere else on the planet, to specific subspecies of deer mice, night lizards, and plants that evolved in isolation just long enough to become genuinely distinct from their mainland relatives. The single most famous of those endemic species is the island fox, the largest native mammal found anywhere across the archipelago, and, remarkably, still one of the smallest canid species on the entire planet, a descendant of the mainland gray fox that shrank dramatically in size over thousands of years of island isolation. Small enough that an adult often weighs barely more than a house cat, an evolutionary phenomenon called island dwarfism that has produced similarly shrunken species on isolated islands around the world. Through the 1990s, golden eagles began establishing themselves as resident breeders across several of the islands, drawn in part by an abundance of not-native deer and pigs, introduced decades earlier by ranchers, prey that gave the eagles an unusually reliable food source they had never previously had reason to exploit on the islands. Golden eagles hunt foxes readily, and with bald eagles, which typically compete with and displace golden eagles, having been decimated across the region by DDT contamination decades earlier, a pesticide that thinned eggshells so severely that bald eagle populations collapsed across much of California and beyond, nothing remained to keep the newly arrived golden eagles in check. Fox populations collapsed with terrifying speed. By the year 2000, only around 15 island foxes remained on San Miguel Island, another 15 on Santa Rosa, and fewer than 80 on Santa Cruz. Numbers so low that extinction within a matter of a few short years seemed almost inevitable, each island subspecies teetering on a genuine precipice with no natural recovery realistically possible without direct human intervention. In 1999, Channel Islands National Park launched an emergency recovery program combining captive breeding facilities built specifically to protect and multiply the remaining foxes in controlled conditions, the physical relocation of resident golden eagles to distant parts of California, far from the islands, the reintroduction of bald eagles to help reclaim the ecological niche golden eagles had exploited, and the removal of the non-native deer and pigs that had fueled the crisis in the first place. That coordinated aggressive intervention worked. Island fox populations have since rebounded dramatically across the park, one of the fastest documented recoveries of a mammal from the brink of extinction anywhere in the United States, a genuine conservation success story that continues to be studied and cited as a model for endangered species recovery programs elsewhere, proof that even a population reduced to just a few dozen individuals can be pulled back from the edge with sufficiently focused, well-funded intervention. Ongoing scientific debate about when and how the earliest peoples first arrived in the Americas at all, with some researchers pointing to finds like this one as evidence supporting a coastal migration route down the Pacific Rim, rather than the traditional inland route once assumed to be the primary pathway. Sewn together from individual planks and sealed with a naturally occurring tar-like substance called yop, vessels capable of navigating the often treacherous channel crossing between the islands and the mainland, a genuinely impressive feat of engineering and seamanship for a culture without metal tools. Evidence of that deep history remains visible today at sites like Painted Cave, where ancient pictographs still mark rock walls near the coast, their exact meaning and purpose still debated by researchers and Chumash descendants alike, and across countless shell, middens, and archaeological sites scattered throughout the islands documenting thousands of years of continuous habitation, layered deposits of shell, bone, and stone tools that, in places, run meters deep into the ground. That long, continuous Chumash presence on the islands ended abruptly and tragically in the early 1800s. European-introduced diseases, including measles, devastated island populations that had no prior immunity, and the arrival of Russian and Aulet sea otter hunters in the early 1800s brought additional violence and disruption to island communities already under severe strain. By the 1830s, the last remaining Chumash islanders had been forcibly removed from the Channel Islands entirely and relocated to Spanish mission settlements on the mainland, bringing thousands of years of continuous island habitation to an end within the span of just a few decades. One particularly haunting story from that same era involves a Nicoleño woman left behind on San Nicolas Island in 1835 when the rest of her community was evacuated, apparently after she jumped from the departing ship to search for a missing child. Some accounts say her own infant, and was left behind when weather prevented the vessel from returning for her as originally planned. She survived alone on the island for 18 years, building her own shelter, hunting and fishing for food, and fashioning clothing from bird feathers and skins, before finally being discovered in 1853 by a party of otter hunters who brought her back to the mainland, where she reportedly lived only a few more weeks before succumbing to illness. Her body had no immunity to resist, unable by that point to communicate fluently in her native language, since no one remaining on the mainland still spoke it. A story of extraordinary solitary survival that later inspired the well-known novel Island of the Blue Dolphins, required reading for generations of American schoolchildren who likely had no idea the story traced back to a real, documented event on one of these very islands. Following that forced removal, the Channel Islands entered a very different chapter, one shaped largely by ranching. Beginning in the mid-1800s and continuing for roughly 6 generations, sheep and cattle ranching dominated much of the archipelago, particularly on the larger islands like Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa, reshaping native vegetation and introducing the very deer and pig populations that would later fuel the golden eagle crisis threatening island foxes generations afterward. Santa Cruz Island alone, the largest in the entire chain, spent much of that period under private ranching ownership, its rolling hills grazed by tens of thousands of sheep at points during peak operation, before conservation organizations and eventually the National Park Service gradually acquired the land specifically to begin restoring its native ecosystem. That ranching legacy remains visible today in scattered historic structures, old adobe ranch buildings, corrals, and abandoned equipment still standing across several islands as physical reminders of that era, and in the ongoing ecological restoration work required to help native island ecosystems recover from more than a century of grazing pressure-introduced species had placed on landscapes that had evolved for millennia without them. Restoration efforts that have included removing thousands of non-native animals, island by island, and monitoring the slow, patient recovery of native plant communities in their absence. Today, the 5 islands within Channel Islands National Park have essentially no permanent civilian population at all. A small number of National Park Service staff, researchers, and seasonal volunteers representing the only people who actually live there for any extended stretch of time. Everyone else arriving strictly as day visitors or campers via boat or small aircraft, with no hotels, no restaurants, and no paved roads awaiting them once they step ashore. Visitors who do make the crossing typically arrive prepared to camp, hike, kayak among the island's famous sea caves, or dive in the kelp forest just offshore. A genuinely rugged, self-sufficient style of travel that keeps visitor numbers naturally low and helps preserve the very wildness that makes the islands worth visiting in the first place. That near-total absence of permanent settlement stands in sharp contrast to Santa Catalina Island, the most accessible and developed of the 8 islands, where the small resort town of Avalon supports a genuine year-round community numbering in the low thousands, built almost entirely around tourism, sport fishing, and its status as a popular weekend getaway destination for residents of the nearby Los Angeles metropolitan area, complete with a historic casino building, restaurants, hotels, and a regular ferry service connecting it to the mainland multiple times a day. A striking illustration of just how differently these 8 islands, scattered across the same relatively compact stretch of ocean, have ended up developing, depending entirely on questions of ownership, accessibility, and historical circumstance, rather than anything about the islands themselves. The waters surrounding the islands carry their own significant history as well. In 1969, a major oil platform blowout in the Santa Barbara Channel released hundreds of thousands of gallons of crude oil into the surrounding water, coating beaches and killing marine life across a wide stretch of coastline in what remains one of the most consequential environmental disasters in American history. Images of oil-soaked shorelines and dying seabirds broadcast into American living rooms at a moment when public awareness of environmental issues was only just beginning to build. The spill is widely credited with helping catalyze the modern American environmental movement and contributing directly to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency and the first Earth Day, just a year later, a genuinely direct line running from an industrial accident off these specific islands to the entire modern framework of American environmental regulation and awareness. That same rich, biologically significant marine environment, now protected as part of the surrounding Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, established in 1980 alongside the national park itself, continues to support extensive kelp forests, seal and sea lion rookeries, and a level of marine biodiversity that remains genuinely exceptional for waters this close to a major population center. The cold, nutrient-rich currents flowing past the islands, supporting an abundance of marine life that draws divers, researchers, and whale-watching boats out from the mainland throughout much of the year. What makes the Channel Islands so remarkable isn't simply their proximity to one of America's largest cities, though that proximity does make their continued wildness genuinely unusual, a national park reachable by ferry from a city of millions, and yet feeling, once ashore, like an entirely different world separated by far more than the roughly 40 kilometers of open water actually standing between them. It's that an archipelago sitting practically within sight of the Los Angeles skyline has managed to preserve 13,000 years of human history, a level of species endemism rare almost anywhere else in North America, and a fox population that came within a hair's breadth of vanishing entirely before an aggressive, coordinated recovery effort pulled it back from the edge. Most places this close to a major metropolitan area long ago traded their wilderness for development, coastlines turned into marinas and beachfront property, hillsides carved into subdivisions stretching as far as the eye can see. The Channel Islands, largely by accident of geography, distance, and deliberate conservation effort, never did, protected first by a stretch of genuinely unpredictable ocean that discouraged casual settlement, and later by the same conservation-minded institutions that recognized exactly what stood to be lost if that protection was ever allowed to lapse. If the Channel Islands' hidden wilderness and remarkable conservation story surprised you, subscribe, because there are more overlooked wild places out there, sometimes closer to home than you'd ever expect.